Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Lucky Finance channel. I'm Lucky Murugesh. Thank you for being here, and if you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. And if you like this video, please hit the like button and also hit the bell icon. So today I'm going to do something a little different. Instead of just giving you stock recommendations, I'm actually going to give you my views of where I think the market is today. Today being June 21st. The Nasdaq hit an all-time high above 10,000 recently. The S&P 500 has pretty much made up all of its losses from the March downturn. The Dow is still a little lower than its peak, but has recovered probably 30% from the bottom. So where do we go from here? And interestingly, the COVID-19 situation is getting more challenging with a possible wave 2 starting sometime soon. We may actually still be in wave 1. And in some states, it looks like a wave 2 is already starting. So I'll give you my views. All right, so stay tuned. Thank you again. Disclaimer, I'm not a financial advisor, and everything I'm telling you is just for informational purposes. And you should really consult your own financial advisor, since investing in stocks is really risky and you need to understand everything. I'm here to give you information. You need to do your own research. And the combination of those two things will give you the knowledge you need. And with your experience, eventually that will lead to wisdom. All right. So I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19. I'll share with you the recent infection and death rates. I'll also talk to you about the impact of COVID-19 on the jobless rate and eventually on the earnings for the S&P 500 and Nasdaq 100. And then I'll give you my estimate of what the real value of the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq should be based on the current situation. And then I'll summarize and make a recommendation. So let's talk about COVID-19 infection rates. So this chart over here shows the infection rates globally, and you can see all the red color here are areas with really high infection rates. You can see certainly the United States, Alaska in there. You can see major parts of Europe, Russia in there. You can see India, where the infection is just starting to pick up at a pretty high speed. You can see a lot of countries in Europe infected heavily. And if you look at the infections globally as of June 19th, we had about 8.14 million confirmed cases. And that grew at a rate of 181,000 cases per day, which is huge. And overall, there have been 446,000 deaths, which grew at the rate of 5,245 deaths per day as of June 19th. And that's a big number. If you look at that as a percentage, basically the infection growth rate is just about 2%, and the death rate is just above 1%. Some of you may have heard that the typical flu that comes around every year has a death rate of about 0.1%. So effectively, COVID-19 has a death rate that's slightly over 10 times, or maybe about 11 times the regular flu. If you project this out by December 31st, even without a massive wave 2, if you just say that wave 1 continues at this rate, that's projected to be 42 million infections globally. That's a big number. And potentially up to 3.5 million deaths globally. Now, I just want to remind you, when the last great pandemic hit in 1918, 1919, the flu pandemic, it killed somewhere between 50 to 80 million people. And the entire population of the world was about 1.5 billion. So clearly COVID is not at the same rate as the last pandemic. But keep in mind, COVID's only been around now for a few months. And already we're talking huge numbers by the end of this year. And if we don't have a vaccine in place by the end of this year or early next year, this is going to continue for a long time. Now let's look at the United States. You can actually see the COVID cases in the United States, which really took off around April, May. And then we started to see the cases come down. But then recently you have another spike. This is when a number of states opened a little bit early, and you start to see a second spike. Some people are calling that the beginning of wave 2. I think we're probably still in wave 1 and maybe just a little bit of wave 2. If you look at the US numbers, again, as of June 19th, there were 2.24 million confirmed cases, which grew at about 27,000 a day, 120,000 deaths, which grew at 624 a day. The infection rate in the US is about half that of the global rate. So it's about 1.2% per day. And the death rate's again about half of the global death rate, about 0.5%. So if you just project these rates out by December 31st without a wave 2, assuming the rates stay in this region, you get over 20 million infections and about 320,000 deaths. And if you remember the CDC, when they first came out with the projection, they said at least 200,000 deaths, then they pulled it back to 60,000. Now they've gone back, I think, to a 200,000 number. I think it's going to be closer to the 300,000 number by the time this is done, by the end of December. If you look at some of the scenarios out there in terms of a wave 2, you can see there's 3 different scenarios people are talking about. One is a whole set of peaks and valleys where it keeps coming and going. One is where we have this major peak. Actually, this is the first peak, and then a second peak probably in the fall, and then it'll kind of go down and maybe have another peak later. And then scenario 3 is kind of a slow burn where we've already been through the first peak and it just kind of tapers down. It's really hard to say, but I think most people are expecting a scenario 2 where there could be a major peak in the fall as the temperature changes and the weather changes. So the key message here is, you know, we have had a number of new infections possibly from early opening in certain states. There's potential future waves of infections. And it's probably a 2 to 3 year recovery to a pre-crisis level. And there's really no virus vaccine, looks like, until Q1 of 2021. So we're going to have to live through at least one major fall period with this virus before we see any kind of vaccine. Obviously, this has huge impact because of the social distancing to the economy. And interestingly, some recent data just came out in the last 24-48 hours, which suggests that even people who claim that they had got the immunity because they got the virus, it seems like that immunity went away within a 2 or 3 month period. So it's not really clear whether once you get COVID, whether you become immune or not. And I think the question is still open. So let's look at what the impact of the economy is. And actually, this is a study that McKinsey put out, which is actually a very interesting study. It's free, it's on the internet. And you can see some of the scenarios over here. You can look at the projections from McKinsey. They project that the United States will drop probably somewhere between 8 and 11%. You can see the world economy drop somewhere between 6.5% and 8.5%. These are big numbers. So this is a massive hit to GDP growth. In the Eurozone, they are predicting up to a 15% drop. So anywhere from 6 to 15% drop to the global economies. And probably a 2 to 3 year recovery period. The other thing is, if you look at the US unemployment rate, you can see we were humming along at 3.6% for quite a few quarters. And then with COVID, we went all the way up to 14.7%. And then recently we came down to about 13.3% unemployment, which is huge. And essentially, you know, you've got at least 23 million non-farm jobs that have been lost. You can see the number of jobs added going along at a pretty good clip. And then with COVID, we had this massive drop of 23 million non-farm jobs lost. And these are jobs, for example, in the hospitality sector, restaurant, waiters, waitresses, people working in the travel industry, leisure industry, hotels, etc. Now, additionally, since this data came out in May, there's been another 10 to 15 million jobs lost in early June. And potentially, even if we have a recovery in 6 months or so, 20 to 25% of those jobs could never come back because a lot of those restaurants might close and never reopen because I don't think they have the cash to burn for so long. So there's potentially, even if we recover, say a year from now, we could still have 8 to 10 million jobs that have been lost forever. And that would be an unemployment rate of somewhere between 8 to 10% for the United States, post-COVID, even with a recovery. So the key message is 40 million people unemployed now, and potentially for the next 3 to 6 months, even with the recovery, potentially 8 to 10 million jobs could never recover. Then this impacts the rents, it impacts house payments, it impacts spending, it impacts obviously social unrest. Really all aspects of our lives are going to be impacted. And there is already a massive discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. That is going to grow like crazy. And this disruption is going to be around for a while. I think this is going to be 2 to 3 years. We might have a little bit of spikes and valleys once in a while, but I think this impact is really massive. So let's look at what this is going to do to businesses. So here are some projections from Yardeni Research, very good research site. They published a paper fairly recently, and you can see this pink bar here shows the S&P 500 earnings. And then in COVID, in 2020, they expect these earnings to drop about 25%. And so if you look at the number for 2020 now, they're projecting about $120 for the S&P 500. Growing to 150 in 2021 and 175 in 2022. And pre-COVID, this was humming along, almost at $170. Now, if you take that number, and for the S&P 500, the average PE ratio, I'm using the Shiller PE ratio, which is adjusted for inflation. That's about 16.7 average. So if you just take that average of 16.7 and you multiply it by the earnings prediction of $120, you get an S&P 500 index of about 2,000, and right now the index is about 3,000. I think it's closer to the 3,100 number. So that's huge. So that's 35% potential drop to bring it down to fair value. Now, if you assume that people say, well, we're going to ignore 2020, we're going to look a year ahead, we're going to look at 2021. Well, even for 2021, if you look at the number here, the projection is $150 for the S&P earnings. And if you multiply that by 16.7, which is the PE ratio, you get a number of about 2,500. So even if you ignore 2020, the S&P is still at least 19-20% overvalued. If you do the same for the NASDAQ average PE ratio is about 17.1. And here's some of the earnings for the NASDAQ projection for December 2020 is about $5.61. Interestingly, the NASDAQ earnings are not hit as badly because a lot of the NASDAQ companies, actually some of them are actually benefiting from COVID because of the internet economy. And some of them obviously have lost. But if you take the NASDAQ earnings, this is for NDAQ, the earnings are at $5.61 for 2020, and you multiply that by 17.1, which is the PE ratio, you get a number of about 95.9. And that's about 19% under what the NASDAQ is trading at today. If you do the same and you ignore 2020 and you look forward at 2021 and you put in the number for 2021, which is $6.16, I think even then you're going to get about 105. That's even at the high rate, by the way. That's on the high side. I think the reality might be more like 580. It's still a 10-15% drop from current earnings. So both the S&P and the NASDAQ are overvalued. I think the S&P is overvalued as much as 35%, and the NASDAQ is overvalued as much as about 19-20%. So my recommendations are really the full impact of COVID-19 is obviously still not known. I think the best estimates are for 30 to 40 million jobs lost in the US in the short term, and possibly 8 to 10 million lost in the long term. And there's going to be a profound impact globally from this, with a GDP drop of anywhere from 6 to 15%, and it's going to take 2 to 3 years to recover just to prior levels. And the hard part is the infection rates are continuing to spread and could reach some staggering numbers by the end of the year, possibly with around 40-42 million people affected worldwide, and maybe 20 to even slightly higher than 20 million infections in the US if we continue to open states too early. And worldwide, around 3.5 million people could die from this by the end of 2020, and with over 300,000 in the United States by year end. Clearly, the stock markets will be impacted. Right now, it looks like the stock market is completely disconnected from COVID, but I think that's going to change when companies start to announce their real earnings. And I think the full impact of COVID will be felt in the next couple of months. And I think my estimates are for a 25 to 35% pullback in the S&P 500, possibly somewhere in the 2,400 range. And at least a 20% pullback in the NASDAQ, maybe back to around 7,800 range. So my recommendation right now is sit back, do your research, get your list of the top 20 stocks ready, and wait for the pullback. And if you need help figuring out which stocks to buy, take a look at one of my other videos. I've got several out there already, and I'll keep adding to this list. So you've got time over the next month or two. Get your list of the top 20 stocks, and I think there's a potential to make a lot of money. Thank you. Once again, if you like this video, please hit the like button, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. and I will try to post a video every week or so. Thank you so much for your time. Have a nice one.